also said that he was behind Lee's march into Maryland on his way to the Battle of Gettysburg, as though Robert E. Lee would take marching orders from a Ohio congressman on, here's a good idea, invade Pennsylvania. But they said these things, and I guess at wartime, I think, as a lot of you know, a lot of people's mental stability seems to be weakened pretty dramatically, and so I think that a lot of the public apparently fell for these things. But there's a historian named Frank Clement, the late Frank Clement, spelled with a clay, who's spent much of his career writing books and articles about the Copperheads, the Northern Democrats who were opposed to the war, opposed to the Lincoln regime. And he shows this is all bogus, all these stories about Vallandigham. But the Washington Times, nevertheless, actually as Inside Magazine, used the Vallandigham story, which it got mostly wrong, to make the case that, well, maybe these congressional opponents of the war today, the Iraq War, should be treated a little more roughly than they are already. Now, to get into some specifics, who are some of these enemies of liberty who love Lincoln? Well, I'll give you some examples. Take Newt Gingrich, for example. Please. He's as you all know, he's the new elder statesman of the Republican Party. If you noticed him on television lately and all over the radio, I've been on a few long drives recently, and some of the radio stations, he's bought some radio ads. And talk about ruining your day to be listening to some good music, and then here comes Newt Gingrich on why we need to invade North Korea. And as an example of the use of the whole Lincoln legend to promote tyranny, there was a September 7th, 2006 Wall Street Journal Online article by Newt entitled "Bush and Lincoln," not to be confused with all those other articles with titles like Lincoln and Bush, and there are many of them, or Bush is our Lincoln. I've read about a dozen articles with that title, Bush is our Lincoln. He says this, quote, "President Bush today finds himself in precisely the same dilemma Lincoln faced 144 years ago," end quote, precisely the same dilemma. And then at the top of the article, the first paragraph of the article, he quotes Lincoln as saying, quote, "We must think anew and act anew," end quote. And of course, what Lincoln meant is we must ignore the Constitution and we must ignore international law and moral strictures against waging war on civilians, and we must act anew in America. And so why does Newt call his article Bush and Lincoln and do all these things? Well, the gist of the article, he calls for an invasion and occupation of Iran, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, and North Korea in this one article. And so, of course, it must be the proper course of action because it's what Lincoln would have done. Now, like I said, Lincoln, according to Newt, who claims he has a PhD in history, and as I said, Lincoln was somewhat of a political genius. I don't think he would have been stupid enough to propose anything like this, anything remotely like this, but he did. Bill Kristol and Michael Novak, after Bush's second inaugural address, I could just imagine their reaction to it. They must have had to change their underwear a few times after this. This is the one where Bush promised to end tyranny on earth, I don't know if you remember that, but that's what he end tyranny on earth. Kristol said this was, quote, "the best presidential speech since Lincoln." So they started, and Novak did the same thing, Michael Novak, comparing Bush and Lincoln, and then so did Bill Bennett. He went crazy. He's written a whole book about it. Then at the same time, you had townhall.com, which was founded by the Heritage Foundation, but then they spun it off. It's not any longer actually a heritage operation, but they did keep the same editor. So even though Ed Feulner wasn't directly running it, they did keep the same editor. And they published several articles with titles like, "Should We Prosecute Sedition?" And sedition would be, of course, opposing the Republican Party's position on the war in Iraq, by Ben Shapiro and Horace Cooper and several other people. And so these are young guys who are sort of aspiring Newt Gingriches, apparently. To look at an old timer, maybe not, I'll skip around here. Another conservative that I write about in my new book is Walter Burns, who's associated with the American Enterprise Institute, and who wrote a book called Making Patriots a few years ago. And I devoted a short chapter, and I sort of paraphrased, or changed around his title, and the chapter is called Making Cannon Fodder. And because he has a chapter and then parts of other chapters that deal with Lincoln. And one of the themes of the book here is that if there's one thing, America has never had a problem, as Ivan mentioned in the last speech. If America's attacked, there's never been a big problem in getting young Americans to volunteer for the military in national defense. But where the problem is, if you have these adventures abroad that have nothing to do with defending America, that have everything to do with some sort of theories dreamed up by somebody at the American Enterprise Institute or the Claremont Institute or somewhere, turn the military into Meals on Wheels with cannons, send them around the world, then you have trouble getting young people to join the military. They don't want to die for free lunches in Somalia as much as they would risk their lives to defend their own family and friends and countries. So this is a dilemma to Walter Burns and the American Enterprise Institute. How do we get young people to become cannon fodder for our theories, for these abstract notions of how we intend to rule the world? Walter Burns says what we need is a national poet who can mesmerize America's youth. He uses these words, national poet, he uses the word mesmerize America's youth into sort of, blindly marching along like lemmings into the nearest recruiting office to save, country X. And so he says, to inspire patriotism in the nation's youth, a national poet must mesmerize them and unite them in a cause. And then he says, fortunately, we already have one. We don't need to go out and look for one. He says, that person is Abraham Lincoln, whom he describes as, quote, statesman, poet, and the martyred Christ of democracy's passion play. So that's how he defines. And then he goes on to say, Lincoln responded to Fort Sumter, where no one was killed or wounded, by the way, with a full-scale invasion of all the southern states. So why did he do that? Quote, because his purpose was peace. Walter Burns. The suspension of habeas corpus, the shutting down of newspapers, the imprisonment of tens of thousands of war dissenters in the North, the confiscation of firearms in the border states. Why did he do this? Why did Lincoln do this? Burns says, quote, so that the laws be faithfully executed. Okay. He also says this, Lincoln never looked upon the Confederates as enemies. Well, that's a direct quote, and the footnote is in there in my book, but I would hope if we're at war, the president would look at the people we're waging war against as enemies and not lovers or something like that. But that's what he says. And so you have the AEI is well represented in the Lincoln quoting warmongering category there. There are quite a few leftists, of course, who also play this game. And one of them is, if you ever see a television documentary on the Civil War, chances are one of the experts that will go on and on and on and on to tell you what you should think about this is Eric Foner, the Marxist historian from Columbia University. And so and he's on all these television shows. Now that James McPherson has retired, he's probably not going to be on quite as much. But Foner wrote an article in The Nation magazine in October of 1991 called Lincoln's Lesson. And in this article, he opposed the breakup of the Soviet Union by arguing that Lincoln would never have tolerated this. He would never have allowed the Soviet republics to secede, all 11 of them, to secede peacefully. He would have invaded. Look what he did to the American South. And so the theme of the article, what is Lincoln's lesson? He says, that the last dictator of the Soviet Union was a softie compared to Abe Lincoln. And he allowed peaceful secession in the Soviet republics, and Eric Foner thinks that's a horrible thing. And of course, Foner, he wrote a book in 1988 called The Story of American Freedom. And he said, one of the things he says in this is, quote, the Communist Party USA is a cultural front that helped to withdraw the boundaries of American freedom.